Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Ange Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 15 running back rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the running back position. We'll begin by talking about matchups going into Week 15 in order to give ourselves a little bit more perspective as to which defenses have been giving up the most points to opposing running backs since Week 7, in order to give ourselves a little bit more information as to which running backs we might want to, of course, play because of said matchups and potentially avoid because the run-stopping defenses and efforts of some of these teams are certainly too difficult to overcome. Now, after we talk about matchups, we'll then transition into talking about our top 36 running back rankings, as I'll share with you guys my opinions and the statistics that justify the reasons as to why I've got them ranked as such going into Week 15. Again, it's the first week of the fantasy playoffs. If you've made it thus far, congratulations. And though it's not easy to get here and it requires a lot of patience, good decision-making, and of course, a little bit of luck on the side, we get into a conversation here where, yes, we're getting into Week 15, but job's not done. We want to go ahead and get past Week 15 into 16, 17, and help you capture a 2022 Fantasy Football Championship. In order to help you do so, you got to subscribe to the channel. If you have not yet already, be sure to do so. We're making daily fantasy football content for the rest of the 2022 season up until Week 18. So for those of you who unfortunately don't have a commissioner that has set their boundaries correctly in terms of when the fantasy playoffs are, we'll still be here to help for those of you guys who need it. Outside of that, of course, if you guys haven't checked out PrizePicks, there's a link down in the description. Now, for those of you who haven't heard, up until Christmas, the next 12 days will be considered the 12 days of Pickmas via PrizePicks. Every single day via midnight, there will be a brand new pick that is holiday themed, open to the public, that you can go ahead, put together in an upcoming entry, and win some money. Go ahead and check that out today. When you use promo code Andrew via PrizePicks, your first time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. We'll go ahead and talk about a couple entries that I'm making later today via the NBA in regards to this episode, and of course, giving you guys a little bit of an idea as to where I pivoted last night in terms of PrizePicks for Monday Night Football. We'll go ahead and talk about that a little bit later on in the episode, but if you guys haven't checked them out, there's a link down in the description so you can take advantage of the 12 days of Pickmas. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about the running back position, beginning with matchups. Like I was mentioning to you guys, we want to focus on matchups at the running back position because it truly is one of the determining variables as to what kind of potential for success we can find from our prospects. Now, on a given weekly basis, we talk about the fact that a lot of the teams on these lists, like you can see to the right of me, are automatic plays. Regardless of who your running back is, you want to start them against said defense. While on the other end of the spectrum, it is quite difficult. But the statistics on screen at this current moment in time give you guys a valuation as to how many fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format defenses have been allowing to running backs over the course of week 7 through 14. Now, when you want to go ahead and talk about matchups, you have to isolate rushing statistics alone, because when we talk about receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns, those are outside of the boundary in regards to matchups based on the research that I've done over the course of the last couple years. The biggest determining factor as to whether or not a running back is going to find success in the receiving game primarily has to do with whether or not their team wants to target them and utilize them in said form. Now, when we isolate rushing statistics alone, rushing yards and rushing touchdowns, we find that the Houston Texans, New York Giants, Seattle Seahawks, Los Angeles Chargers, Chicago Bears, Green Bay Packers, etc., have been giving up the most points to opposing running backs over the course of the last 2 months now. While on the other end of the spectrum, we have the Tennessee Titans, which we know, and San Francisco 49ers, that we have to avoid at all costs. I mean, there was a reason why I was so down on Travis Etienne last week. There was an expectation for that run-stop defense to completely shut him down. There's a reason why we were avoiding the likes of a Rachaad White and or Leonard Fournette, because we know that the San Francisco 49ers on the ground are going to lock it up. And yes, those running backs can have potential value in the receiving game, which saved their weeks. But if in fact your running back is in a difficult matchup and they don't have the exposure to opportunity in terms of receptions, it's certainly going to be a tough ask to play them and expect a high volume of fantasy points. Okay, we're going to go ahead and refer back to these statistics over the course of today's video, as we'll be talking about matchups individually in regards to players. But this pretty much gives you guys a statistical value as to what we could potentially expect to see based on fantasy points allowed to running backs over the course of the last 2 months. Now let's go ahead and transition into talking about our top 36 running back rankings for week 15, beginning with our number 1. It is Christian McCaffrey. Christian McCaffrey the last 2 weeks has been incredible for fantasy purposes. 24, 28 fantasy points, and now goes into a week in which he takes on the Seattle Seahawks defense, one of the best matchups you could possibly ask for, like we were just mentioning in regards to matchups. Just the most recent performances against this defense, last 4 games, they've given up to Carolina 180 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. To the Los Angeles Rams, they gave up 2 rushing touchdowns, 69 yards, and we know how bad the Rams rushing attack is this season. The Las Vegas Raiders, of course, we know that huge performance that Josh Jacobs put forward, 273 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns, and even Tampa Bay's backfield, 164 and a touchdown. The last 4 performances against the Seattle Seahawks give us a little bit of an idea as to what we can expect from Christian McCaffrey. With Deebo Samuel out at least this very week, there's 4 potential rushing attempts that are now available to running backs in this backfield, specifically hoping they're going in the direction of Christian McCaffrey, because we know that Deebo Samuel has had himself 2 rushing touchdowns in the last 4 weeks. If more opportunity is going in the direction of CMC, I'm expecting him to have a big game. Just against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers just this last Sunday, he had himself one of the best performances I have seen him put forth this season, in which he had 5 rushes of 10 or more yards. That is elite level running, and if you can get into that conversation on a weekly basis, fantastic. Unfortunately, his receiving numbers weren't up there, but that's typically had to do with the fact that they were never trailing in that game. They won 35-7. If in fact they need Christian McCaffrey to be a receiving back, by all means, we can expect that to be a given. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about our number 2 going into this week. We have the one and only Derrick Henry. King Henry had himself a pretty good game on Sunday. Now, unfortunately, all the damage was done just in the first quarter, and then everything went out the window. Just to give you some perspective, for the 19 fantasy points that Derrick Henry had, 121 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 3 catches, 34 yards, he had himself 10 carries for 92 yards and a touchdown just in the first quarter. From quarters 2 through 4, he had 7 attempts for 29 rushing yards and 0 touchdowns. Unbelievable, mainly because the game went from a 14-7 score at the end of the first quarter to becoming 29 unanswered points that the Jacksonville Jaguars dropped on top of their heads, resulting in a score of 36-14 before the Tennessee Titans were able to score once again. With that matchup and the game script going out the window, of course, we saw more utilization in the receiving end from Derrick Henry, but in terms of rushing attempts, was completely nullified. Going forward into this week against the Los Angeles Chargers, one of the easiest matchups at the position. In fact, the second easiest, as they're giving up the most yards per carry on average since week 7, a 5.32 yard per carry average. Unbelievable. I expect Derrick Henry to completely go off. Again, the most recent performances against this defense. Miami does not want to run the ball against them. Still found themselves 64 rushing yards, but Las Vegas 154 and a touchdown. Arizona 125. Kansas City 140. San Francisco 127 and a touchdown. Atlanta 177 and 2 touchdowns. Seattle 202 and 2 touchdowns. An incredible matchup against the defense that can't stop the run. Moving on, let's talk about Josh Jacobs. Now, we just mentioned Josh Jacobs going up against, some of these former matchups. He took on the Seattle Seahawks, which Christian McCaffrey has the privilege of taking on. He took on the Los Angeles Chargers just a couple weeks back, which, of course, Derrick Henry is going to dominate against. But going into this week, the Las Vegas Raiders have their biggest test to date. It is a matchup between Josh McDaniels and his former teacher, Bill Belichick. They're taking on the New England Patriots, which again are one of the better run-stopping defenses in the National Football League. Of course, James Conner had a lot to say about that last night. Nonetheless, Josh Jacobs is an automatic play. We know it. Regardless of the fact that every single week he is questionable to play, the man still toughs through it and absolutely balls out. Had himself 27 rushing attempts last Thursday on a short week when everyone was expecting, he's dealing with a quad injury, a calf injury, left the game early with a little bit of a pinky injury, ended up coming back in the game and just kind of rolling through it. Either way, Josh Jacobs, just to give you some perspective, in the last 5 consecutive games has put up more than 17.5 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format in each of those contests, and has been able to do that in 8 out of the last 10 games that he has played. He's an automatic in my mind. Of course, you're starting him going into the week. Moving on, let's talk about Austin Ekeler. All right, we find ourselves Austin Ekeler taking on the Tennessee Titans. Like we mentioned, it is the toughest matchups for running back at the position in regards to how many points the Tennessee Titans are allowing in terms of rushing statistics alone. Only giving up a 2.88 yard per carry average since week 7. Pretty good numbers there. That being said, the Tennessee Titans are also giving up, since week 7, the most targets, 65 total, the second most receptions, 51 total, and the second most receiving yards to opposing running backs, 359 total, over the course of the last 2 months. So, in a conversation in which you have Austin Ekeler, who does not rely upon his rushing statistics to be the stud that he is every single week, and will get himself a volume of receptions that can't be contested by any other running back in the National Football League at this current moment in time, against a defense that struggles and forces teams to throw to their opposing running backs, I think this is a perfect combination for success. I think Austin Ekeler going up against this matchup, it doesn't mean that there's no realm of possibility in which he can find the end zone on the ground. He certainly can, especially when, in fact, they get into a conversation where the Tennessee Titans cannot stop Justin Herbert and this passing attack. with, Mike Williams back looking healthy, Keenan Allen, Josh Palmer, DeAndre Carter, Gerald Everett, and of course, Austin Ekeler in the receiving game. There's a lot for the secondary to try to bottle up. They weren't able to do that up against Trevor Lawrence, and the Jaguars are going to have a tough time against this Los Angeles Chargers team. And of course, Austin Ekeler will succeed because of that. Moving on, let's talk about Miles Sanders, at number 5. Miles Sanders has played incredible football. And this upcoming week, he has an incredibly advantageous matchup going against the Chicago Bears. Like we mentioned, they're giving up a lot of points to opposing running backs. Just to give you guys some specifics, in the last 6 games that the Chicago Bears have played, when we go ahead and total entire backfield fantasy points in terms of rushing statistics alone, in the last 6 games, they've given up 33.4, 13.7, 19.9, 11.1, 21.2, and 18.5. Incredible numbers across the board. I think the way that Miles Sanders has approached this season and the way that the Philadelphia Eagles are dominating teams at the point of attack, especially running the ball early and finding a lot of success in doing so, I'm expecting Miles Sanders to have another big week here. We know that Lane Johnson obviously is dealing with an abdomen strain. Hopefully it's nothing more than that, and maybe, doesn't miss this week, because we need the all-pro right tackle in this offensive line ready to go in order to help Miles Sanders succeed. But if in fact he even does miss, we know that the rest of the guys are going to step up and get the job done. This is another advantageous matchup in which he should be dominating up against. The final thing I wanted to mention, of course, since 2014, there hasn't been a single 1,000-yard running back for the Philadelphia Eagles. Of course, Miles Sanders this season has accomplished that. Of course, the first time since, LeSean McCoy has done that since 2014. And of course, LeSean McCoy was the last running back in this organization in 2011 to surpass 10+ rushing touchdowns. Again, Miles Sanders was already able to accomplish that. He's setting records and getting himself set for a huge bag this offseason. All right, let's move on to Tony Pollard, our number 6. Tony Pollard, he's just too consistent. 3 out of the last 4 games, even with Zeke active, putting up 20+ fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. He's number 1 amongst all running backs with at least 100 minimum rushing attempts this season in terms of yards after contact per attempt, a 4.02 average. I mean, there are running backs this season that aren't even averaging over 4 yards per carry in general. This guy's doing it after contact. On top of it, he's the number 2 running back in terms of rushes of 15 or more yards, only after Nick Chubb. We talk about him being a home run hitter. Those are actual metrics that give us a little bit of an understanding as to just how effective he has been. Going against the Jacksonville Jaguars matchup this week, again, recently, like we mentioned, Derrick Henry, 121 rushing yards and a touchdown, 92 and a touchdown just done in the first quarter alone. Obviously, game script pivoted in the other direction. The Detroit Lions recently, 97 yards, 2 touchdowns. Gus Edwards, 52 and a touchdown. Pacheco, 82 rushing yards. We've seen success against this defense. I'm expecting Tony Pollard to continue that going into this week. Let's move on to James Conner, the thumbnail of today's video. I mentioned this exactly last week, and it came to fruition last night on Monday Night Football. When James Conner doesn't have another running back breathing down his neck within this Arizona Cardinals offense, he is a fantastic RB1 option, and that's why I have him at number 7 this week. Primarily because when there's no Chase Edmonds and or Eno Benjamin, and James Conner is playing 75 or more % of the offensive snaps, he is averaging 20.56 fantasy points per game in the 10 games in which he's accomplished that. 5 of those games being with Colt McCoy, and for the remainder of the season will have to be with Colt McCoy due to the unfortunate ACL tear that has now been confirmed for Kyler Murray. Extremely unfortunate, disheartening, and for the fantasy options there, in terms of receivers, D-Hop, of course, Marquise Hollywood-Brown going forward, it's going to be a definite difficult transition. That being said, for James Conner, it's not going to be. In the 10 games in which he has played as the primary back of this team, the guy's averaging 17 carries, 65 yards, 1.1 rushing touchdowns per game, 4.8 targets, 4.5 receptions, 38 receiving yards. A little bit of a sprinkle in terms of receiving touchdowns, but again, over 20 fantasy points per game. Like we mentioned, it's going to be with Colt McCoy, and going forward, especially up against the Denver Broncos, who gave up a bunch of receptions to Jerick McKinnon just this last week. Expect James Conner to get a lot of utilization in the receiving game. 7 targets, 6 catches, and 29 yards on Monday against New England. With Colt McCoy throughout his career in the last 5 games that they have played together, 5 targets, 4 reception per game average. I'm expecting to see a lot of potential upside. And without the interference of Kyler Murray down in the red zone, James Conner is getting every single red zone rushing attempt henceforth. Moving on, let's talk about Jonathan Taylor. Coming off the bye week, should be able to look great. The only issue is they take on Minnesota, and at times Minnesota has shown that they can be great in terms of stopping run. Sometimes they're terrible. Now, with those middle-of-the-pack matchups, we typically have to hope that the talent of our running back can get the job done, and the opportunity is certainly going to be there for Jonathan Taylor to do exactly that. Over the course of the last 4 games that he has participated in since coming back from injury, he has gotten himself a minimum of 20 rushing attempts. On top of it, he's been able to contribute a minimum of 94 total yards and a minimum in the last 3 weeks of 3 receptions per game. If you just go ahead and take a baseline of his overall fantasy production just off those statistics alone, we're talking about 10.9 fantasy points without a touchdown. You include a touchdown, considering he has scored 3 touchdowns in the last 4 games, it's about 16.9 fantasy points at a bare minimum. If he goes ahead and does anything beyond that, we're expecting huge numbers from Jonathan Taylor this week against the Minnesota Vikings defense. Let's move on to Aaron Jones, our number 9. Now, the last time we saw Aaron Jones, unfortunately, week 13, he left the game due to a shin injury. He did end up coming back in the second half, but only got 2 touches. They wanted to limit him, and they knew they were going into the bye week, and they didn't have to utilize him because they were already, leading in that game against Chicago. Now, we go into this week. Hopefully, Aaron Jones is going to be healthy, because since week 7, in the 5 games in which he has played fully healthy, hasn't left due to an injury. He has been able to average, this is a ridiculously high number, of 18.56 fantasy points per game, averaging 15 rushing attempts, 77 rushing yards, 6 targets, 5 catches, 32 receiving yards, and 0.8 touchdowns per game on average. They take on the LA Rams this week, and yes, it's a difficult matchup, but we know for a fact when Aaron Jones is healthy, over the course of the last 2 months now, he has been the RB1 clear. And for sure, A.J. Dillon is going to get himself contributions in this backfield, but it's not going to be enough to stop us from starting and getting success out of Aaron Jones in the given week. Let's move on to our number 10, Ezekiel Elliott. Zeke has just been unstoppable. You can't do anything but play him. He has been incredible since coming back from his injury, which we thought may have dislodged his entire season, but it really hasn't. Over the course of the last 6 consecutive games, he has produced a minimum of 15 half PPR fantasy points, putting up a singular touchdown in every single one of those games, while still averaging, since week 12, 4.81 yards per carry on average. That is an incredible number, and even with, on Sunday, Terrence Steele, their starting right tackle, going down and having a season-ending ACL injury, you bring in Jason Peters, the future Hall of Famer, you plug him into the right tackle position. Hopefully, Tyron Smith is going to be returning this week, which will only make this offensive line and their efforts that much stronger. Going forward, Ezekiel Elliott is an unstoppable force, scoring touchdowns every game, scoring 15 plus fantasy points every game, and going up against Jacksonville, like we talked about with Tony Pollard. This is going to be a very advantageous effort for the Dallas Cowboys running backs. The only thing I wanted to mention is the comparisons between Zeke and Pollard in terms of opportunities. Over the course of the last 4 weeks now, since Zeke has returned, we've seen a contribution from Zeke of 63 rushing attempts for 273 rushing yards and 5 rushing touchdowns. In comparison to Tony Pollard, 55 rushing attempts, 273 rushing yards. Again, that's identical numbers for both of them, and 3 rushing touchdowns. Obviously, Pollard typically gets more, overall upside from his receiving work, but we've seen a contribution of 10 targets to 16 targets, of course, in the favor of Pollard, and 65 fantasy points from Zeke to 84.8 from Pollard. Either way, Pollard's dominating, but Zeke's getting just as much, if not more, touches. And going forward, if he continues to find the end zone, is an absolute RB1. Moving on to Dalvin Cook, our number 11. Dalvin Cook takes on the Indianapolis Colts. Again, the Indianapolis Colts secondary, in terms of coverage, are pretty good. Stephon Gilmore, Isaiah Rodgers, they've got some really good players back there. If Kenny Moore is healthy and active, they could end up causing some problems for Kirk Cousins. But what we've witnessed over the course of the last month has been just the opposite of that. No one can really slow down Kirk Cousins and this passing attack. They've continued to rely upon it, and they're continuing to succeed because of it. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, when we talk about this Minnesota Vikings running game, it hasn't been very successful, especially in terms of fantasy purposes for Dalvin Cook. 3 out of the last 4 games for him, less than 10 fantasy points. And it's not for a lack of trying. The guy's had himself red zone opportunities. He's had himself goal line rushing attempts and just hasn't been able to clutch up and score just enough points to get us into that conversation. Obviously, coming off a week of 15 attempts for 23 yards and a touchdown against the Detroit Lions. Only 8.1 fantasy points. We're going to talk about the Detroit Lions matchup in just a bit, but there really needs to be a case study done in regards to the complete turnaround of the Detroit Lions run-stopping defense, which we've been monitoring. And, of course, we want to avoid going forward just how well they've played. But when we're talking about matchups in specific, the Indianapolis Colts one is one of the best that you could possibly find. Pittsburgh, most recently, 131 and 2 touchdowns on the ground against them. Dallas, 197 and 4 touchdowns on the ground from running backs. I'm expecting Dalvin Cook to have himself a big week here. Moving on, let's talk about Saquon Barkley. Now, we have heard reports after the, of course, blowout that occurred between the Philadelphia Eagles and the New York Giants that the reason why Saquon Barkley only played 31.25% of the offensive snaps, 20 of the total 64 snaps, was because of the score rather than his injury. And they have now confirmed that he is dealing with a stinger. And if that's going to be something that potentially slows him down or maybe makes him miss this week, that could be rough for us. But assuming he goes ahead and plays once again like he did on Sunday, we should see a pretty big week here against the Washington Commanders, which they took on just a couple weeks ago. Just to give you some perspective, in that matchup, Saquon accumulated 63 rushing yards on 18 attempts, had himself a rushing touchdown, 5 targets, 5 catches, 16.6 half PPR fantasy points. I think this is a very easily repeatable overall performance for him going into the week, assuming he's going to stay healthy. And with a couple offensive linemen coming back every single week, we're in a conversation where Saquon Barkley can get back on track and hopefully have himself a big performance here. Let's move on to our number 13. Let's not cover his face. It is Nick Chubb. This has been quite some time since I haven't had Nick Chubb in the top 12. And the fact of the matter is, truth be told, is that this offense has kind of changed over the last 2 weeks. With Deshaun Watson in the mix, it really hasn't looked like the old Cleveland Browns rushing attack. 31 rushing attempts, which have only led to 114 rushing yards, which is a 3.67 yard per carry average. Putrid numbers for one of the best running backs in the National Football League. Now, he's coming off of a performance that, quite frankly, we don't want to see ever again. But he takes on the Baltimore Ravens, which again is one of the worst matchups you could possibly ask for. In terms of rushing statistics allowed to opposing teams, I mean, the last 6 games have been brutal. Running backs have combined for Tampa Bay 43, New Orleans 37, Carolina 24, Jacksonville 42, Denver 68, Pittsburgh 48. No single running back group, backfield, over the course of the last 6 weeks has surpassed 70 total rushing yards. That is brutal. Now, the last time we saw that occur was Nick Chubb back in week 7 against this defense, where he accumulated 91 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown for 17.7 fantasy points. Fingers crossed he could put together another one of these big performances against a division rival, but it's going to be a tough matchup on hand. Let's move on to Joe Mixon. Unfortunately, my biggest fear came to life. Samaje Perine is getting himself a lot of utilization in this backfield, and not in terms of running back rushing attempts in the red zone. I don't really care about that. Samaje Perine only scored that touchdown because they were in the 2-minute drill, and they got down there with a minute left and he ran it in. But that is the biggest fear, that in 2-minute drill scenarios, Joe Mixon is no longer going to be the go-to receiving back. In fact, in terms of total targets, Samaje Perine had 5 and Joe Mixon had 2 on Sunday. And if that's going to continue to be the case, and the overall upside of potential in terms of total touches that we see from Joe Mixon is going to go downhill, it could certainly impact him in terms of what he can potentially produce on a weekly basis. Now, going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week doesn't really scare me. We've seen running backs run through this defense all season long, and it's not going to stop here with the Cincinnati Bengals, as their offensive line has looked incredible. But even with Joe Mixon getting less and less overall utilization in the receiving game, I just want to preface that all of last season, Samaje Perine was in his back pocket stealing receiving work for the entirety of the year, going even into the NFL playoffs. This is something that we have seen, something that we have experienced, and even then, Joe Mixon was a top 3 running back in half PPR last season at the end of the season. There is still potential for him to find the end zone and be a relevant fantasy play regardless of Samaje Perine's overall utilization within this backfield. Moving on, let's talk about Alvin Kamara. I'm going to give Alvin Kamara one more shot here. He takes on Atlanta. It's a division rival, and the Atlanta Falcons, they've been burnt by a bunch of running backs as of late, and hopefully Alvin Kamara can be the next one. Since week 7, opposing starting running backs have scored, in terms of fantasy points, 16.6, 31.8, 20.6, 19.0, 19.6, 19.5, and 9.7 against the Atlanta Falcons defense. The most recent one, of course, the most underwhelming one was Najee Harris, but of course, coming off the injury that week. Outside of that, every single other performance over the course of the last 2 months has been 16 or more fantasy points from starting running backs. Hopefully, Alvin Kamara will not continue his streak over the course of the last 5 games, where he's been averaging only 9.6 rushing attempts per game and 6.66 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. That's an omen already, that his fantasy point per average is 6.66. Hopefully we can get off of that trend and into far more advantageous positions. But at this current moment in time, this is the final week we give Alvin Kamara a chance, because if in fact he can pull through here, the next upcoming matchups are beautiful for him in the fantasy playoffs. Moving on, let's talk about Isiah Pacheco. Isiah Pacheco takes on the Houston Texans. Speaking of beautiful matchups, they are the easiest matchup going into the week, giving up an average of 22.84 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics alone. That is 146 rushing yards per game, 1.38 rushing touchdowns per game, and a 5.07 yard per carry average to opposing running backs since week 7. Over the course of the last 5 weeks, Isiah Pacheco has been the primary back of this team, averaging 16 rushing attempts, 79 rushing yards, 11.6 fantasy points per game. And over the course of the last 3 weeks in specific, has seen himself 1, 2, and 3 targets. The receiving overall upside is going up. And in my mind, going into this week, I'm expecting to see a lot of utilization of Isiah Pacheco, especially once this team mounts a lead. Unfortunately, Andy Reid gets bored of running the ball, And even when they have a mounted lead, especially like in this last week's game against Denver, where they're up 27-7, but they're throwing the ball for some reason on first down and second down and forcing themselves into tight positions on third, it is what it is. Either way, I'm expecting to see Isiah Pacheco with high upside because of the matchup this week. Moving on, let's talk about Travis Etienne. Travis Etienne has had 4 consecutive performances of less than 10 fantasy points. 8.8, 0.3, of course, that was the injury week, 6.1, and 3.2. Unfortunate performances across the board, but again, they've been rough matchups on top of that. Now, going into this week, they take on the Dallas Cowboys. With Dallas's secondary obviously being in shambles, it could lead to, of course, a lot of opportunity for Trevor Lawrence to stretch the field, and if in fact they are able to do so, reduce the stacking of the box, and we get ourselves more utilization on the ground from Travis Etienne coming off a week where he had 17 rushing attempts. The opportunity is there, but we just need a little bit more effectiveness against the defense that is giving up their fair share of points to opposing running backs on the ground. Of course, we just saw Dameon Pierce put together a good performance prior to the fourth quarter injury. I'm expecting a bounce back week here for Travis Etienne. Moving on to Brian Robinson, the final of our top 18. Brian Robinson took on this matchup just a couple weeks ago. He put up 12.1 fantasy points, 96 rushing yards on 21 rushing attempts. We have talked about how much success running backs have found against the New York Giants, and it continued last week where Miles Sanders put up 28 fantasy points, while Boston Scott even later in that game was able to score a touchdown. But outside of Miles Sanders, we've seen Ezekiel Elliott, 16 fantasy points, and Jamaal Williams with 24.4 fantasy points. We are always in a sketchy position in regards to Brian Robinson because of the contributions of Antonio Gibson. Over the course of the last couple weeks here, we have seen Antonio Gibson and Brian Robinson split 80 rushing attempts to 50, and overall yardage 344 in favor of Brian Robinson to 187 in the position of Antonio Gibson. He's pretty much dominating 60% of the rushing attempts and 62% of the rushing yards. If in fact that continues, red zone potential touchdown upside, the fact that in the last 2 games he has had 5 targets, 4 receptions, 35 receiving yards, and a touchdown, he gets more utilization there. I'm expecting a big week from Brian Robinson. All right, let's go ahead and move on, and let's talk about the second half of this conversation in regards to running backs going into week 15, the fantasy playoffs. I know this is a long episode, but I want to give you guys as much information as possible. Before we get into talking about Damien Harris and or all New England Patriots running backs, whether it is Pierre Strong and or Ramondre Stevenson, I want to talk about PrizePicks. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the next 12 days are going to be the 12 days of Pickmas. Be sure to take advantage of it. There's a link down in the description. You use promo code Andrew today when you sign up to make that first-time deposit. So when you do so, you get your first deposit immediately doubled up to $100. Check out the link in the description. Thank you. But in terms of talking about potential plays, picks going into this week, we want to talk about what I was able to accomplish last night, because by all means, when you're able to add a couple NBA players to an entry, it really does find success. I've been on a little bit of a streak here. Last night, besides the absolutely brutal play, let me scroll down here. The absolutely brutal play of Ramondre Stevenson getting hurt and Greg Dortch not even being a participant in this offense, I had a couple other entries. Unfortunately, Tyler Hero wasn't able to pull it out, but we were able to put together a couple entries here in which we're adding a couple NBA players, and it's going well. Going into tonight, I wanted to go ahead and share this entry with you guys. I currently have the taco for tonight. Again, don't forget it's Taco Tuesday. That means there's a discount on the overall points in a specific statistic, which we'll, of course, take advantage of in regards to Joel Embiid, who's on a bit of a streak here, along with LeBron James, Mr. Taco Tuesday himself, and Jordan Poole, who over the course of the last 5 weeks here has been starting. And when he's starting, we're expecting a lot of points from him on a weekly basis. We're going more on all 3 of these. You can go ahead and check that out either way via PrizePicks. There's a link down in the description. Be sure to check them out today. Thank you very much. All right, let's get back into the action, beginning with our number 19, Damien Harris. I have Damien Harris here because we know that Ramondre Stevenson went down with an ankle injury last night. If that's going to hold him out for this week, then of course, the question is whether or not we should trust Damien Harris and or guys like Pierre Strong or Kevin Harris. Pierre Strong and Kevin Harris combined for 13 carries, 96 rushing yards, and 2 rushing touchdowns, 2 catches for 20 yards on 2 targets, and 24.6 fantasy points. It doesn't matter who is the starting running back for this team. The scheme itself and the offensive line's efforts is always going to be enough for fantasy points. We have witnessed that over the course of the last 5 years. Now, going into this week, if Damien Harris gets back to becoming the starting running back of this team, I'm expecting a minimum of 10 fantasy points from his direction, if not 12, 15 points with upside. He's going to get himself a lot of utilization, and because of the potential of him coming back from his injury that has forced him to miss the last 2 weeks, there may be some sprinkles of Pierre Strong in the backfield, but ultimately I believe that Damien Harris with an injured Ramondre Stevenson is the go-to if in fact he's available in terms of waivers. Let's move on. Let's talk about J.K. Dobbins coming off an incredible week of 120 rushing yards and a touchdown, 18 fantasy points. I do want to preface, when I watched that game back yesterday, It's tough to watch J.K. Dobbins run. And the reason why I say this is because there is still a noticeable limp and he does struggle laterally. And that's a given, right? He's not going to be fully healthy. It's not going to be until the 2023 season where we can trust him every single week blindly as a potential top 15 upside player. Now, as of this upcoming week, they do take on the Cleveland Browns, and there's a lot of potential there. But I do want to preface as well that the Baltimore Ravens did have 29 total running back rushing attempts, 15 run in the direction of J.K. Dobbins, and 13 towards Gus Edwards. J.K. Dobbins had himself big runs, but a lot of it had to do with the fact that this offensive line, these tight ends, this fullback, of course, Patrick Ricard, their efforts were unbelievable. They were opening up holes and allowing J.K. Dobbins to make plays, even without his full strength and speed under his legs. Either way, going into this week, they take on Cleveland. It's an advantageous matchup. Cleveland over the course of the last 5 games, just to give you some perspective. 184-2 to Miami, 164-1 to Buffalo, 79 to Tampa Bay, 91 rushing yards to Houston, and of course, Cincinnati went for 120 and a touchdown on Sunday. I'm expecting big success from these running backs in Baltimore, specifically J.K. Dobbins. Moving on to David Montgomery. Over the course of the last 3 games without Khalil Herbert contributing and, of course, being on the IR, we have seen David Montgomery averaging 15.7 half PPR fantasy points per game, averaging 15 carries, 69 rushing yards, 0.67 total touchdowns, which again, that's a touchdown in 2 out of the last 3 games. 4 targets, 3 catches, 31 yards. Pretty good numbers. Now they take on the Philadelphia Eagles. This is going to be a windy, cold game. And what that typically promotes is, of course, the running game. And in the case of the Chicago Bears, that has been the best facet of this team overall, whether it's through the running game of David Montgomery, Khalil Herbert, or Justin Fields. Going into this week with no Khalil Herbert still there, going up against Philly. Again, Ndamukong Suh has been the primary D lineman that has helped stop the run. Linval Joseph, Jordan Davis, they're getting themselves into this conversation. But even in a potential negative game script, there's going to be targets available and red zone opportunities that are certainly going to be there. Moving on to Najee Harris, number 22. Listen, Najee Harris is an automatic. We know that we have to play him, especially considering he takes on the Carolina Panthers. They've been giving up 97 rushing yards per game, 0.57 rushing touchdowns, and a 4.96 yard per carry average since week 7. He has scored himself 4 touchdowns in the last 4 games. Obviously, the last couple weeks have been a little bit tricky. One coming off the injury, the other one in which he was injured, and then, of course, this last week, Kenny Pickett leaving the game early, and, of course, the game script and the fact that they had to come back in that game once the Baltimore Ravens had mounted a lead certainly did lead them away from running the ball. But in this current position, I expect Najee Harris to be back on track with a big performance here. Hopefully, the rushing attempts get 20 plus, because when that happens, we know big success is to follow with Najee Harris's fantasy performances. Moving on, let's talk about Zonovan Knight. Like I was mentioning earlier, there needs to be a case study done on what exactly has shifted in the Baltimore Ravens defense that has allowed them to turn around what exactly they have done this season. Their defense has been unbelievable in terms of stopping the run. They haven't allowed 100 total rushing yards from a backfield since week 7. I mean, just this last week, Dalvin Cook had 15 carries for 23 yards. An unbelievably unfortunate performance. They're only allowing 3.79 yards per carry since week 7. Now, Zonovan Knight pulled through for Andrew, and he, again, is going to be the maintained starter. Like I was talking about this last week, they don't trust Michael Carter, and that's a given. Even though Michael Carter played majority of the snaps, he is not the go-to in terms of running. We had 17 attempts, 71 yards, and a rushing touchdown go in the direction of Zonovan Knight. If, in fact, we are going to see Joe Flacco within this offense, do not worry. If Mike White is going to be injured and out, over the course of the last 3 games that we have seen Joe Flacco start for this team, weeks 1 through 3, he targeted his running backs an average of 13 times per game that led to 9 receptions and 60 receiving yards and 0.3 receiving touchdowns per game on average. Incredible numbers across the board. I'm expecting to see Zonovan Knight, of course, continue to be the primary running back for this team and have a lot of fantasy value. Moving on, let's talk about Jamaal Williams. On the other end of this coin, we talk about, of course, the Detroit Lions trying to move the ball on the New York Jets, and it's not impossible. But the biggest issue I have with Jamaal Williams is that at very best right now, he's probably going to be a 10-point play. Gets himself 60 rushing yards, maybe 40 rushing yards, gets himself a rushing touchdown, scores himself 10 fantasy points, and with the dependence of being a goal line, back and being handed fantasy points on a weekly basis because you're, 1 yard and in, obviously it does diminish the value of Jamaal Williams, especially when they're in tougher matchups, when the running game hasn't been as successful, and we're looking towards a matchup in which perhaps DeAndre Swift gets a little bit more utilization, but we'll talk about DeAndre Swift in just a moment. Let's move on to our number 25. It is Kenneth Walker. If Kenneth Walker does end up playing, or whoever ends up being the starting running back of this team, again, it's going to be brutal. The 49ers have been allowing just 50 rushing yards, 0.29 rushing touchdowns, and 3.53 yards per carry on average since week 7. I think Walker coming off the injury is probably going to be limited in his utilization will probably be in a little bit of a committee. And if that's going to be the case, his overall value is going to be diminished. We'll keep an eye on it. That's why rankings are subject to change. We'll see exactly where we have him by the time we get to Sunday morning. Moving on. Let's talk about D'Onta Foreman. D'Onta Foreman going into this week's matchup, again, it should be pretty advantageous. They take on the Pittsburgh Steelers. It's a middle-of-the-road matchup. As long as the opportunities continue to go in Foreman's direction, it's going to be a pretty good week. 24 rushing attempts, 21 rushing attempts. Those are his overall opportunities in the last 2 games. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to come down with a touchdown, even though he had 4 opportunities inside the 10-yard line of rushing attempts. 2 of them inside the 5-yard line, which he wasn't able to, of course, flourish into a 6-point rushing touchdown. Unfortunately, that is just, that's the nature of the beast. That's fantasy football. But over the course of the last 2 weeks, it is promising to see that the Carolina Panthers have ran the ball 41 times and 39 times with their running backs. On top of the fact that we're in a conversation where, of course, D'Onta Foreman is getting a majority of those, 56% of those rushing attempts in his direction. With this team being potentially a playoff team, they could continue to fight and see if they can put together some wins here. Moving on to Rachaad White, our number 27. Speaking of still being a playoff team, I don't know how they're leading the division. This Tampa Bay Buccaneers team is just, it's a mess. And hopefully they'll continue to give Rachaad White the early down rushing work, but it's going to be tough to continue to see him, have to split with Leonard Fournette, especially with how ineffective Fournette has been, the injuries he continues to pop up with. Going into this upcoming week against Cincinnati, Cincinnati's defense really looks like they're playoff bound, and they're in that playoff form already in December. So it's going to be tough in my mind. But either way, Rachaad White could very easily get himself over 10 fantasy points any given week, even without a touchdown, because of the contributions he's getting on the ground through the air. They just have to be consistent in those opportunities. Moving on to Chuba Hubbard, the other half of the conversation in regards to the Carolina Panthers. Chuba Hubbard, like I mentioned yesterday in the waiver wire video, should be the number 1 running back, probably picked up off waivers outside of Damien Harris at this point. Now, going into this week, of course, it's an advantageous matchup like we mentioned, but he has been able to garner 14 and 17 rushing attempts in the last 2 games. That's 31 of the last 80 rushing attempts within this offense, about 39% of them. Overall, pretty good numbers, but in my mind, he's still going to play second fiddle. But if the Carolina Panthers are going to continue to run 40-plus times per game on average over the last 2 games, and that's going to be a continued effect going against Pittsburgh, I'm expecting to see, of course, Chuba Hubbard be treated like any other RB3 that has upside to become an RB2, just like he, kind of proved to us last week. The current record for the Carolina Panthers is 5-8. Current record for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers with Rachaad White next to him is 6-7. They can make the playoffs. They just need to make a push here and win these games, especially up against Mitchell Trubisky this week. Moving on, Raheem Mostert. I don't trust the Miami Dolphins running game. Mike McDaniel just doesn't want to run the ball. I do not understand it. With Tua struggling so much in the passing game, I think Tua at one point was 3 for 17 passing. Did I hear that wrong? There's just unbelievable numbers that we witnessed on Sunday, yet they don't want to run the ball. I get it. Your running game is mediocre at average. You don't want to run the ball. You just want to continue to pass and use those other playmakers. You're not even using Waddle. Either way, they literally only run the ball just to set up play action, which they're the second most passing yards out of all teams in the National Football League on play action plays, and they use a lot of RPO. But in my mind, going up against Buffalo, there's an advantage to be had. Running backs have been able to find success against this team on the ground as of late. It's just a matter of whether or not, of course, Raheem Mostert is going to be asked to do so. Without Jeff Wilson there, he's the primary back. Again, since week 7, Buffalo's giving up 4.82 yard per carry on average. Zonovan Knight, 17 rushing attempts for 71 rushing yards and a touchdown. There's a lot of success to be had here. You just got to run the ball. And hopefully, they'll be forced to do so because of the fact that this is going to be a very cold weather game in Buffalo. Maybe snow. A lot of winds for sure. Maybe forcing them away from passing the ball. Let's move on to DeAndre Swift at number 30. I don't know what to do with DeAndre Swift anymore. One week he's great, the other week he's a bum, and all of a sudden now we're sitting at a crossroads where we're not 100% certain as to whether we can start him. Justin Jackson is being used primarily as a third-round back. We have Craig Reynolds coming back, designated to return from the injured reserve, could get some utilization. If this becomes a four-headed monster in this backfield, I wouldn't be surprised. DeAndre Swift is not getting enough rushing attempts, receiving attempts to be a valuable fantasy back, and it's not for a lack of trying. I mean, of course, he's putting forth the effort, but they're not giving him enough opportunity. And even when he's given opportunity on the 1-yard line to potentially score, if you don't come away with that touchdown, that's 6 points, your week is dead. As of right now, I think he's an RB3 with potential upside, but in comparison to these other running backs, he's not going to get as many touches. And when we're determining potential upside based on a volume of opportunities and the effectiveness that you have with said opportunities, it's tough to trust DeAndre. Moving on to Cordarrelle Patterson, at number 31. Again, we talked about Tyler Algier on Monday. Cordarrelle Patterson is going to be given the number 1 rushing attempts, probably. We'll see how it transitions after that. In week 1, he took on New Orleans, 22 rushing attempts, 120 rushing yards and a touchdown, 21.1 fantasy points. With Desmond Ridder taking over the quarterback position for this team, it's going to be a little bit more pass-friendly in my mind. We have seen over the course of this season, Cordarrelle Patterson run about 12, overall routes per game. If his receiving upside continues to grow, could be even more valuable than number 31 at the end of the week. Moving on to number 32, we have Devin Singletary. Devin Singletary had 29 snaps compared to James Cook 24 and Nyheim Hines 10. If we're going to continue to see a 3-headed monster here, Singletary will continue to be the lead back of the Buffalo Bills, but it's not enough to convince me to absolutely have to start him. In a game in which it should be cold weather, hopefully we'll force him to run the ball behind a pretty good offensive line. Singletary could have value. He needs to find the end zone, though. Moving on to Cam Akers, number 33. The Green Bay Packers matchup is incredible, and Cam Akers has gotten himself 29 rushing attempts in comparison to Kyren Williams' 6 rushing attempts over the last 2 games. With Baker having a little bit of an extended period of time with this offense, should be a more, fleshed out offense as a whole. But the Green Bay Packers matchup is advantageous. We know this. Since week 4, the Green Bay Packers have given up 82 rushing yards minimum per week and have given up 10 rushing touchdowns in the last 10 games already. There's a lot of potential for upside here. If Cam Akers gets himself, 40 rushing yards and a touchdown and gets himself 10 points at the end of the week, I wouldn't be surprised. Moving on to Latavius Murray. Latavius Murray was pretty much phased out of the offense on Sunday, mainly because of the game script. When they're down 27-7 with, what is it, like 4 minutes and 32 seconds left in the second quarter, you have to pass the ball. Mike Boone got injured. Marlon Mack had an unbelievable scoring touchdown. For those of you who haven't seen Marlon Mack's touchdown, please go watch that. An unbelievable, play made by someone that, again, has been quiet over the last couple years after his Achilles injury. Either way, in terms of the opportunities that we have seen, a guy like Latavius Murray garner over the last 4 games, 55 total rushing attempts, and has been pretty effective with them. He's only had 4 rushes of those 55 for negative yards. In my mind, should be another one of these good plays this week. Moving on to Leonard Fournette. Again, I don't trust him at all. He's been injured. He's been ineffective. And yes, he does have upside in a PPR, but outside of a PPR scoring format, can't really trust him as a running back option elsewhere. Moving on to Jerick McKinnon. Jerick McKinnon has a chance. Because it's Houston, he could run the ball for, 10 plus times and we wouldn't be surprised. But I think the receiving numbers that he put forth on Sunday are obviously going to be difficult to duplicate in any sort of capacity. Do not expect those numbers. Expect him to maybe get himself 10 rushing attempts, probably 3-4 catches, maybe scores a touchdown. That's his very best potential week. But outside of that, he's a primary PPR option with Pacheco obviously dominating about 15 to 20 of the rushing attempts within the offense. All right, guys, that covers it for me. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Tomorrow, we'll talk about wide receivers. I know this was a long episode, but that's the point. It's week 15. We're not messing around. We're giving you all the information that you could possibly handle in regards to these players to get you ready, to help you make the best possible decisions by the end of the week. Do not forget, subscribe to the channel if you have not yet already. We'll be making daily fantasy content. Tomorrow, we'll be talking about wide receivers. Thursday is quarterbacks and tight ends. Friday, of course, some must-start players. Saturday live stream, Sunday live stream. And until then, thank you, everybody, for watching. Be sure to check out PrizePicks like we mentioned. Put together some entries, whether it's tonight, tomorrow night, for this weekend's games of the NFL. And of course, be sure to check out the 12 Days of Pickmas. Outside of that, guys, thank you, everybody, for watching. Be sure to click the like button. Let me know if you have any questions down below in the comment section. And until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.